Hello, everyone, and welcome. About exactly a month ago, I hopped in the car with a friend of mine from grad school and drove down to good old Blacksburg, Virginia, to give a presentation at a academic history conference. My presentation was the title that you see on the screen here, Europa Universalis IV, Grand Strategy Video Games as History. It was a very cool opportunity to be able to speak about EU4 in more of an academic setting. I have obviously made a couple videos where I've talked about something like this before, and I wrote a paper on which this presentation is based a couple years ago, basically about the ways in which EU4 kind of constructs the idea of Europe as a coherent social, geopolitical, whatever entity. And yeah, this was a interesting experience for sure. I've not like given a presentation about it before, and everyone was quite impressed and got lots of questions, just because not the kind of thing that people usually expect you to talk about at an academic conference. This I can breeze through parts of this because you all know this game, unlike most of the people who were watching my presentation at the conference. But obviously, EU4's world right here. I think I took this map from the like Steam directory game files, whatever. This was all of the images in this presentation are from the paper that I wrote 2 years ago. So they're all based on whatever version of EU4 was out 2 years ago. So it was obviously post-Emperor. You could see, for example, that France is divided up into all of its little duchies, or vassals, whatever. But otherwise, reasonably recent. Everyone was quite impressed by the sheer number and amount of territory covered by quote-unquote uncolonized provinces in this game. Obviously, that's kind of one of the absurdities of this game is the arbitrariness with which it decides who gets a state and who doesn't get a state. Obviously, there are people in most of these uncolonized provinces, but they are determined to be stateless as opposed to many other people. So they're can just be stomped on. Another image that you will be very familiar with, the intro screen to EU4. This is what you are shown. As soon as you click play game, whatever, in the main menu. I always think that this is kind of an interesting framing of the game in terms of what it's kind of showing you as the center of the world. Europe right here. This is Europe. However you want to define it. And the thing at the bottom, the paragraph basically describing the intro, the way that you are supposed to be introduced into this world, talking about rumors of Ottoman weakness, whatever, the Crusade of Varna, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, there's a lot of information, a lot of decision making packed into this intro screen. The decisions that the developers made about what they wanted to show, how they wanted to display it, whatever, which I think is interesting to look at from a historical point of view, kind of the purpose of this paper or presentation. The agenda of the presentation is given it again. First, why EU4, basically. Why is this an interesting source to look at, document, and however it is, why is it an interesting game? And then the bulk of the paper that I wrote and the middle two sections of this presentation are on basically how the game constructs this geopolitical or social unit of Europe, both from the outside and from the inside. That was the class for which I wrote that paper 2 years ago was called The Idea of Europe, and it was literally all about how Europe as a cohesive regional unit was developed between basically kind of over the span of this game. It went a little more modern, it got into European Union and everything, but a lot of focus on the period of this game. And then finally, how we can look at EU4 in kind of conclusion as a source or a document. This presentation is very much just an introduction, kind of skimming the surface. There's not a lot of super deep analysis here, but I just kind of think it's an interesting way to jumping off point, whatever, for this subject. So first, why EU4? It's a fun game. Obviously, that's silly, but that's why we're all here. We wouldn't be here if we didn't find it fun. If it wasn't a fun game, no one would play it, and if no one played it, then it wouldn't really matter because it wouldn't matter for this analysis because it wouldn't be impacting the way that people engage with history. It's in the name as well. There's so much so many different expectations and kind of paradigms are packed into the phrase Europa Universalis, Universal Europe, which are also, broader, more broadly contained within this game. Millions of people play. I didn't do that much research on this. I couldn't find a more specific number than 2 to 5 million, which is obviously a huge swath. But one interesting point for this that has stuck with me is that, like, other games that are based on history and use a lot of historical research, like, for example, Assassin's Creed. I'm sure there are other examples. I mean, like, I think that Firaxis employs like a historian for Civilization or something. Those games may sell 3, 5, 8 times as many copies as EU4, and they come out more frequently, obviously, than Paradox games. But the thing about those games is that they are like primarily, story based or fun, board game, whatever. They're not. Most people playing those games are not necessarily coming to them from the basis of like being interested in history at a more kind of intellectual or semi-academic level. And I contend that EU4 is different, as are other Paradox games, because the numbers of players may be a bit smaller than, like, the real AAA games, but there are far larger of percentage of people playing this game who are coming from that real, like, they are interested in history, they study history, they know a lot about it, they want to learn more about it, they're kind of coming to the game to engage more with it. Like, there's a more serious baseline of engagement with history from the average EU4 player than, I would guess, the average Assassin's Creed player, for example. And then the game obviously covers a massive space, both temporally and, chronologically and also geographically, which I think is one of its selling points for me. I mean, it's one of the many reasons that I never really became a Crusader Kings guy. It's just kind of cool that you actually can play the entire world in EU4, whereas Crusader Kings, it's always limited. It's like the whole world there are no limits geographically. And then this period of 1444 to 1821 is such a, like, basically from the medieval period to modern era, and that is such a cool kind of transition to be able to participate in or form or whatever. And then there are just so many histories within the game, so many different little regions. Now on to the way that EU4 represents history more specifically. Now you could ask these questions about the way it constructs any region in the game. I just happen to choose Europe because that's what the game focuses on. But there's a lot of historiography that has argued over the last few decades that just generally kind of sought to find where exactly the European identity came from as a regional concept, social concept, whatever, because obviously any political construction is entirely socially constructed. And the presence of the Ottomans, both in terms of the strength of the threat, but also in terms of the enduring nature of the threat, is, many historians have landed on this as one of the biggest reasons for which Europe kind of created itself in opposition to the Ottomans, not just because they were not Christendom, but because of the language and culture and geographical differences and the military might and everything. And a lot of it was religious as well, but religion wasn't the only thing. And it's interesting is that, like, obviously Europe had faced external, quote unquote, threats before from other Islamic or other powers, whether it was the Moors in Spain or who lasted a long time, or the Mongols in Eastern Europe, who were immense and very strong. But the thing about those is that the Moors in Spain, it was pretty clear from early on that they were not getting any farther than Spain and Sicily. The Mongols, no one knew what was, like, they could have taken, for what everyone else knew, they could have taken all of Europe. But as soon as it became clear that wasn't happening, within a couple of generations of actually basically within the generation after Genghis Khan died, the entire empire fell apart. So it wasn't like the threat didn't last very long. The Ottomans have both. The Ottomans were at the gates of Vienna for 150 years, and they were the strongest army in the world for a long time. So it's interesting to think about the way that their presence constructed Europe as an identity. And I always find this last sentence in that opening paragraph in the game, in that start screen: peace was eventually signed, but the way for further Ottoman expansion into Europe now lay open. It's like challenging the player. Like, what are you going to do about it, basically? The Ottomans are here. What are you going to do about it? And then building Europe from the inside, the Holy Roman Empire. Now it's interesting. So in that first screen where you're kind of presented with Europe and you get to choose your country or whatever, it really just talks about the Ottomans and European resistance to the Ottomans in that text. But then as soon as you choose a country in Europe, whether you're in, Lithuania or Spain, England or Bulgaria, whatever, Transylvania, anything. What is it? Transylvania is not a starting country. It's Wallachia. When you click play and it takes you into the game, it gives you that little pop-up that you always get, like the kind of geopolitical setting of your country. And it'll always say, when you're playing in Europe, no matter where you are, it's Europe. And it's always about the Holy Roman Empire. It's always Europe is home to the Holy Roman Empire. There's not actually a discussion of Europe beyond basically the HRE. And there's this like 4 or 5 paragraphs about the HRE, which I always thought was an interesting choice. They don't talk about anything else. That is like, the setting is Europe and Europe is HRE. And this is a historiography that is not as well developed, just because the Holy Roman Empire is mostly the subject of medieval historians. And if you are a early modern or modern historian, particularly kind of international global historian, you're really not talking about the HRE, because the HRE lacked what the English, the French, the Spanish, Russians, Ottomans, whatever, in that it was not a expansive empire that went out into the world and established colonies all over the world and had this kind of global, whatever, political, economic influence that, ended up bringing about the modern globalized world as we tend to think about it. But this book by Peter Wilson, Heart of Europe, subtitle, A History of the Holy Roman Empire, is one of my favorite books that I've read over the last 5-ish years. And I used it. So my first year of grad school, I was at Columbia, and I used it for every paper that I wrote, for like at least every final paper, I just think every like general paper for all like 7 or 8 classes that I took or something, as a secondary source. And his thesis is basically that no matter where you are in Europe across the ages, you were in some way kind of connected to the spider web of the HRE, even if the HRE did not expand beyond Europe as these other empires did. Like, all of these empires were connected to the various decentralized elements of the HRE, diplomacy, dynastic, commerce, everything. It was really like not just the geographical heart of the continent, but this kind of like social, spiritual heart that everything could be connected back to. It was like all roads, political roads went in some way to the HRE, which I thought was a very, and then it allows, like, that. The interesting thing about that book is that it then allows you to write, it allowed him to write about the entire history of Europe, because through the lens of the HRE, basically, and how everything is connected, which I thought was really interesting. And the HRE was kind of like an entity that allowed statesmen from Poland and Spain and England and Hungary to all be connected in one place at the various different councils. Council of Constance, I think, and comes to mind in the 1300s or whatever, but Treaty of Westphalia, everything. EU4 is a source or document. So one of its greatest strengths, again, going back to the fun thing, is it draws us much deeper into history. Again, so many of us are coming from a place of deep interest in history, and there's just so much text there in the game, so much detail, that it's just like, it's a delight. I mean, that's certainly why I come back to it. I think that is why a lot of people come back to it. That's why my friends come back to it, is that there's just so much information and detail and everything to work with there. It's just like fascinating endlessly. I always just feel like I learned so much. There are so many little places in the world, regions, states, topographical features across the world that I only know about because of EU4. Where capitals are, where cities are, everything. I was never a particularly good geographer until I played this game, and now I know where everything is, which is pretty amazing. And just being able to talk about all of the little minute details of history, whether it's of Manipur, which is the example I always give, a little one province minor in the Himalayas. Like, who's ever heard of that before if you're not from Southeast Asia? But it's there. They've got it, just as they have England and France. They've also got Manipur and other one province minors in the Himalayas. The issue with EU4 is, of course, that as a historical document or something that kind of claims implicitly, if not overtly, to be a historical document, is that there are no citations anywhere. It's not, you can't even really figure out who did the research, let alone where they got that research from. And that is just, that calls into question the validity of all of this meticulous detail that we're experiencing here, because how could you verify that this is actually true and not just made up for the purposes of the game? Because obviously this is a historical document, but primarily it is a game designed to sell copies. And so the game will always be first serving its players, and second at best serving the literature, the historiography, like accurately representing the world. It will readily make sacrifices, and does, in its kind of the accuracy of its historical representation in order to benefit the player's game playing experience. And so we can see that in anything from borders, for example, particularly in 1444, probably still in 1821, but definitely in the late medieval, early modern period. Borders, national borders, all this kind of scientific delineation of where one polity ended and another one began, that did not exist in any capacity. I mean, there was maybe the very beginnings of scientific surveys mapping territory, but really not in a meaningful sense. And who the heck knows where the Ming Empire ended, the precise line where the Ming Empire ended in Burma or Tibet or anything. I mean, even Vietnam, which was an old border that China always had, in some sense or another. No one knew exactly where that was. It was always being moved. It only existed because there would be guards there enforcing it. But then as soon as they left, then the border didn't exist anymore. And it's not just the case in East Asia. I mean, it was the case at city, state, national, quote unquote, national country, empire levels, whatever, in Europe, all over the world. There was just not, because of the lack of surveillance technology, centralized administration, everything, there were not borders in the way that we think about them now. And so it's weird, in a sense, to create a historical document, being this game, based around the idea of these hardline borders that really did not exist in this period. Another misrepresentation, of course, could also be what I discussed briefly earlier, is the kind of arbitrariness with which it was decided who gets a state and who doesn't, basically. Why is it that, some Native Americans get to be a playable country and a bunch of the other ones are just random nameless guys on this province that you just stomp on every few years when they uprise, unless you chose the native policy that is native coexistence. So that is it's kind of the voice of the developers is deciding what it means to be a state, rather than the actual historical literature. And I'm sure that some of these things wouldn't stand up to that kind of research. But it's a game, It wouldn't be fun, arguably. I mean, people make that argument. I've seen this on the forums before. I've participated in these arguments, probably, maybe on the opposing side. But many people have argued that the game just wouldn't be fun if there were not provinces to colonize. That would change the dynamic. And then finally, some questions. How else could EU4 frame the story of Europe? Other than the Ottomans and the HRE, what other elements, political elements, social, philosophical elements, science elements, whatever, could it use to define Europe as a coherent, semi-coherent, developing social or political body? How could a game tell the story of this period without a European Universalist teleology? That is to say, it kind of fades into the background. You don't think about it that much, but really one of the like core pillars of this game is the technology. I mean, that's like the whole argument here is that at the beginning of this game, everyone's kind of on the same technology, whether you're in Europe, China, India, Southeast Asia, whatever. But it is by the end of this game when everything has diverged. And it is because, and that is purely because everywhere else in the world has not been able to keep up with the Western technology developments, which always end at technology 32, and technology 32 is always the same for everyone except for some minute variations in the troop types and whatever. How could that teleology be broken down such that it is not just kind of forcing everything to be just like, it's like everyone is just trying to be like Europe by the end of the game, and if you're not keeping up, then you're not keeping up. Either from a real historical perspective or an alt historical perspective, could we have like kind of emergent technology trees that are not just linear, ending up at, everyone's ending up at the same place? I think that's an interesting point. And then finally, what responsibilities do developers have when representing history to millions of players? Arguably, cite your sources is the biggest one. But again, this is a game. There's no legal obligation to do that. But I'm sure that, people have other ideas of what responsibilities these guys have when kind of implicitly, if not necessarily overtly, claiming to tell this, semi-objective narrative of this world history. Because that's the thing about, if you know anything about geography, the like science of geography at all, is that maps have a kind of veneer of scientific accuracy because they're, images, visual, whatever, they present such a kind of solid representation of ideas and relationships and everything, that you look at a map and you're like, that just, it looks like so much work went into that, that just, you kind of take for granted that it's just real. It's presenting reality. But obviously an image like that always involves abstractions at best and misrepresentations on average. And so in this sense, like what responsibilities do the developers have to remind the players, whatever, that this is all kind of, from a certain perspective, subjective. This is not like, it's not like the game is representing even geography as it really was, in a sense that like they're making sacrifices in accuracy in favor of benefiting the gameplay experience. There's obviously so much to talk about here, I think there's a lot more research that could be done, a lot more kind of discussion about these subjects, but the purpose of this presentation was basically just to kind of give an introduction about some of the ways that we could look at EU4 as a piece of historiography, as history enthusiasts or whatever. So yeah, that was my presentation. I hope that this is not the last time that I return to this game as a kind of way of looking at history in a more academic sense. I'm always doing that as an enthusiast. Whenever I play the game, I'm always thinking about that. I've kind of moved away from doing that in like an academic sense recently, other than this presentation, but it's always something I'm thinking about. So yeah, if you have thoughts about these questions, thoughts about the presentation, anything, if you've ever done anything like this before, I more than welcome you sharing. As always, it's a pleasure to talk to you guys about this, and see you next time.